Hi, my name is Jared and this is Horror Obsession. Today I want to talk about A Quiet Place Day 1, the prequel to A Quiet Place starring Lupita Nyong'o. The first A Quiet Place is a well-paced, tightly constructed monster thriller that is just scary enough to qualify as a horror movie, and while it had some flaws, it was a very fun, engaging movie. A Quiet Place Part 2 was not as good, and honestly the best part of the movie was the beginning when they showed the origin of the monsters from the perspective of Jim and Emily's family, so when they announced the third movie was going to be a prequel and focus entirely on the monsters' initial attack, I was pretty excited. After having finally seen the movie, I will say I was a little disappointed. It is not a horrible movie by any means, and I enjoyed it for the most part, but there were a lot of weird decisions, and it is easily the most flawed movie of the three. If you liked the first two, I recommend checking it out since the basic outline of what makes those movies good is still there for this movie, and Lupita's performance alone is good enough to justify watching it. But let's jump into spoilers so I can talk about some of the movie's misses. First of all, let's go through the basic setup, which isn't going to be long because the plot is very, well, basic. Lupita is a hospice patient, and the guy from Hereditary is her nurse, and they all decide to take a trip to New York City to check out a play, which as it turns out is a marionette play. Afterwards, Lupita really wants to go get pizza, but there is some kind of emergency in the city and they need to head back to the hospice facility immediately, which deeply, deeply upsets Lupita for some reason, and she yells at her nurse.
Yes, you're getting...
Okay, you gotta calm down. Calm down.
Don't tell me calm down.
I don't want to argue with you. I'm your friend, okay? And
You're not my friend. You're a nurse.
This starts one of the most baffling decisions in Day 1, which is to make Lupita's primary character motivation to get pizza from this specific place in the city. I understand that what they are going for is she is dying and wants to eat at one of her favorite restaurants one last time and feels this will be her last chance to do so, so she gets very defensive about it. The part that is confusing is why they decided to give her character such a strange and specific motivation without paying it off at all. I kept waiting for them to explain that she used to go to that pizza place with her mother before she died, or it was her first job, or something, so that her desire to have pizza there is properly motivated, but they never did. The entire thing reminded me of Woody Harrelson in Zombieland, how he desperately wanted a Twinkie and most of the movie is spent with him searching far and wide for one. That movie is a comedy, so his motivation being bizarre and nonsensical makes more sense. But Day 1 is trying to be serious, so a more rational motivation would have been nice. Speaking of the movie trying to be serious, there are a few lighthearted moments, but the tone of the movie is a bit dour for me. I mean, we start off with our main character dying in hospice, and the movie ends with her suicide. There isn't a lot in between for the audience to feel happy about, except the cat and Eddie getting away, and I think the movie would have benefited from toning down the depressing stuff a bit. Another criticism I have of Day 1 is shared with the other Quiet Place movies, which is they have very derivative scary scenes. Ghost movies and slashers often rely on a trope called investigate a strange noise, where one of the characters hears something and starts slowly walking around looking for what caused it, inevitably ending with either a jump scare or the character being killed. Quiet Place inverts this trope, and instead of the characters investigating a strange noise, the characters are making the noise, and then the monsters are investigating it. Let me give an example. Hereditary guy has to go turn off the generator, which is automatically switched on, so it doesn't attract the monsters. However, once he gets it turned off, he just kinda stands there waiting to die.
I'm gonna be your instincts. Kunu will be your instincts. Don't do anything. The less you do, the more you do. But you gotta do more than that.
This happens a few times in the movie, and it gets more and more frustrating each time it happens. The intelligence of the characters varies dramatically from scene to scene depending on what the writers want the outcome of the scene to be. Like when the monsters first attack, somehow almost everyone in the city instantly concludes the monsters attack based on sound. How do they do this? No idea, and the writers don't know either. It just kinda happens, and everyone's being quiet all of a sudden. Except a few scenes later, everyone is walking towards some ships to evacuate the city, and suddenly everyone is making a bunch of noise by dragging luggage across the ground. To the surprise of literally no one, the monsters hear it and attack, and then the people are running and screaming as if they don't know the monsters are attracted to sound again. Why do they do this? I guess because the writers thought the scene would be kind of weird if people weren't screaming. And sure, I get that some people's fear would overwhelm their ability to suppress their screaming, but it really feels like they somehow forgot that is what attracts the monsters. It was very confusing and clearly just inconsistencies from the writers trying to force scenes in a direction they want them to go, logic be damned. Another mistake, which is kind of a small one, but I think they should have just kept the nurse friend. They have him die in the generator scene, which is mildly surprising, I guess, but it isn't really a hugely emotional moment or anything.
Don't do anything.
And then they quickly replace him with Eddie from Stranger Things. The problem with this is now we have to establish a new relationship between Lupita and Eddie instead of having the character work already done between the hereditary guy and Lupita. Swapping out these characters doesn't really do anything for the story, but it does kill the momentum of the story halfway through and slowly drown an already glacially paced movie even further. Along the same lines, when Lupita eventually meets up with Eddie, they are just kinda walking through the city. The movie is constantly choosing to have certain sounds attract the monsters, and other times there is conveniently something causing just enough noise to mask the sound. In one scene, we want the shuffling of people's feet to attract the monsters, so there you go. In another scene, we want Lupita to be able to open a can of cat food. Okay, let's just have there be a fountain there. In one scene, talking is likely to attract the monsters, so everyone is writing stuff down. And then in another scene, they are perfectly fine whispering. One of the things that was great about the first Quiet Place was the attention to detail, including the family putting sand down between the buildings so they wouldn't make noise when they walked, and using their underground oven thing to cook, or the fact they mostly communicated with sign language. In the biz, they call this world building. And instead of doing that in day one, they just kind of use contrivances to explain away sound if they don't want it to attract the monsters. Oh, it's raining, so the characters can talk if they want to. Oh, there's thunder, so they can kick down the door. Speaking of that scene, apparently Lupita has walked with her cat and Eddie all the way back to her apartment, which is kind of strange. At the start of the movie, she is at hospice, and then she gets invited to downtown to see a play, but she goes home first and puts on a fentanyl patch, then goes back to the hospice place to take the bus into the city. The carnage happens, and she eventually walks back to her place. So what's the problem? Well, an important piece of information is they receive a message saying to avoid the bridges, and we don't see them go over a bridge, so I think we are supposed to assume Lupita is still in Manhattan. When she is taking the bus from hospice into the city, we see her going over the Manhattan Bridge, which connects Brooklyn to Lower Manhattan right here. So we know the hospice is somewhere in Brooklyn. With this information, we know that Lupita apparently starts in Brooklyn at hospice, then goes home to her apartment in Manhattan, then goes back to Brooklyn just so she can turn around and take the bus right back into downtown where she just was. Even more confusing, she says she hasn't been to downtown in forever and thinks this might be her last time. So I guess she doesn't live in downtown? But then how did she walk there without crossing a bridge? Or maybe she did cross a bridge, but if she did, why did they bother with the message specifically saying to avoid bridges? The entire thing is a jumbled mess. And the writers definitely just skipped over a bunch of this, hoping the audience wouldn't notice. Another reason this matters is because when Lupita gets back to her apartment, she has Eddie kick down the door, which they wanted to do because they thought it would be cool to show the characters syncing up the kicks with the thunder to avoid detection from the monsters. But Lupita didn't have the key to her own apartment, so I guess she was at hospice, went home to her apartment, then went back to hospice to take a bus back to downtown, but along the way she just leaves her keys at the hospice for reasons. Normally I am not this nitpicky when it comes to stuff like this, but these problems speak to a larger issue of the movie having poor attention to detail. The original Quiet Place has amazing attention to detail, which made the world of these monsters feel more realistic and was a major part of why the movie worked so well. Day one is so sloppy with the details, like they don't ever address how Eddie and Lupita can walk through the city with their regular shoes on and not attract the monsters. Or how Eddie can be like 6 inches away from a monster and it doesn't hear his heartbeat. I mean, a human ear can detect a heartbeat if you put your ear next to someone's chest, and Mr. Super Hearing Monster can't hear it? In a movie like this, a major part of what makes it fun is trying to determine what you can and can't do, so the audience can imagine what it would be like to actually live in this world. It is impossible to create these scenarios in your imagination because they are changing the dynamics of the monsters at every turn, and I think this would have not been a fatal flaw if there was more to the story. I typically start thinking about little details like the shoes making noise or where Lupita's keys are when the story is dragging, and Day One's story drags the entire film. There is no overall thrust to the narrative, no motivation driving the characters forward except Lupita wanting to get pizza and her and Eddie trying to get to the water so they can escape. There is this funny scene where Lupita arrives to the pizza shop she has been trying to get to, but oh no, it's burned down. I honestly don't know what she was expecting, but the scene is played as this big emotional letdown, and it rang so hollow for me. Day 1 would have benefited from giving the characters a real motivation, like Lupita is trying to escape the city so she can see her daughter one last time before she dies. Or she is dying from something curable, so if she can get to an army base with medicine, she will live. Creating a race against time for her to get out of the city before the disease overtakes her. The ticking clock is a common strategy to increase tension, as the characters have a specific goal they need to accomplish and a specific amount of time they need to do it in, so that when there is a setback, it ratchets up the tension with the audience even further. The ticking clock in the original Quiet Place was Emily Blunt being pregnant, and the characters trying to soundproof the house enough to have a baby before she goes into labor. Simple, effective, and a big part of why that movie worked. They are trying to rebuild civilization and prove humanity can exist by having babies in a world with sound monsters, but all we get in Day 1 is Lupita wants pizza. Other times, she just dinks around the city watching Eddie do magic tricks. There's no urgency to anything, even though they are also kind of trying to get to the boat, but half the time they forget that's their goal. Day 1 tries to be heavy on theme, but it comes at the expense of story. The marionette play certainly has some kind of deeper meaning, but I'm not going to be the one to figure it out. Alright. So I think the marionette is a metaphor for human society, and the balloon probably represents technological advancement. And soon, this technology is lifting humanity up. However, the balloon pops, which I guess is the aliens coming and putting us in our place and destroying society. There you go. As far as the overall narrative, they show Lupita and Eddie derping around the city looking for pizza, which I think is supposed to be a nihilistic look at the world not really mattering, which is through the perspective of Lupita since she is dying and doesn't really give a shit about anything. I believe the choice to leave her with an absurd motivation was intentional, and meant to accentuate the theme of despair about death. But that is, shall we say, not a very entertaining way to construct your movie. I mean, my god, even Schindler's List gives the audience something to latch onto and root for, which in Day 1 I guess is Eddie and the cat surviving. I would have preferred to give Lupita a specific motivation, which we've talked about several times, even if it was a bit silly like I want to save my cat's life. That's what the audience ends up rooting for anyway, so you may as well just make it her explicit motivation. Overall, Day 1 is an alright movie. There are significant flaws in the execution of a great premise, including failing to properly motivate the characters. Lupita wanders the city looking for pizza and makes a half-hearted effort to make it to the boat to save them. That is, when she isn't traveling back and forth from Manhattan and Brooklyn repeatedly for no reason. The details of the movie are all over the place, changing at the whim and convenience of the writers to push the story whatever direction they want it to go, with minimal regard for what logically makes sense. There is almost no consistency between what the monsters can hear from scene to scene, and especially from movie to movie, and the result is a boring, depressing, repetitive movie that fails at some of the most basic elements of storytelling. There is enough interesting stuff and cool visuals to rescue the movie to some extent, but it feels like such a missed opportunity, even for someone with a quiet horror obsession.